maybe this is something we can talk about in the second segment, but I feel like as science podcasters, we're held to a little bit higher standard of like, we can't get away with what a comedian could get away with in terms of just shot. Because we're not as, maybe that's something about how fundamentally entertaining we are, but it's, I feel like there's a different standard of, of audio quality.
We're not funny enough to get away with.
I guess not.
Making mistakes.
Yeah. I've had the same sort of thought when I listen to other podcasts, and I'll have that like, yeah, but I get it.
Well, we're going to try our damnedest to be funny this time.
Yeah.
Let's do it. We can do it.
From ScienceSortOf.com, you're listening to Science Sort of.
You are listening to Science Sort of. This is episode 287. Our theme this week is Descent into Madness. Joining me, Ryan Haupt, to talk about things that are science, things that are sort of science, and things that wish they were science is paleontologist Will Harris.
Hello.
And also joining me is paleontologist Dave Moscato.
Hello.
Dave or David?
David's fine.
David's fine. Okay, so you two, we're going to talk about this later in the show, but you are the hosts of the Common Descent podcast.
Yes, we are.
Indeed.
And unlike Science Sort of, which just flirts around with all the different branches of science, you guys are a more specifically paleontology podcast production.
Yeah, that's definitely where our focus is. Yeah, we will branch out every now and then into the topics that regularly pop up within that field, but it's mostly focusing on paleo.
Cool.
Yeah.
Well, we're going to talk more about your show and its role in the science podcastiverse in a minute. But first, I just want to ask you who the hell you think you are. So
we get that a lot, actually.
Yep.
As I understand from my extensive research, the two of you met and became friends while at East Tennessee State University.
Correct.
A university that has produced more guests for our podcast than maybe any other, interestingly enough.
Hey.
Really? Who else has been on the podcast?
One of our earliest guests we got on was a fella you might know by the name of Dr. Blaine Schubert.
Hey, I met him.
We know that guy.
Episode 18, way back in the day.
Wow.
And so, Will, I believe he was your advisor while you were at ETSU?
Yes, he was my advisor. I was studying alligators under him, and so we worked on the skull.
So we're going to start with you then, and can you tell us a little bit about, maybe your introduction into wanting to study paleontology and then what led you to the master's program at ETSU?
Absolutely. So my intro to paleontology itself goes way, way, way back. I said I wanted to be a paleontologist. My parents will quote when I was 5. So it was one of those where I learned the word from one of my dinosaur books. I said, yep. And then I would continually tell that to people when they would ask me, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I'd say a paleontologist. And the sweet old lady at the checkout counter would go, oh, and that is? And so that was me all the way up through college. I even when I was dabbling in other stuff, I was always heading this direction. And I discovered ETSU actually through one of my professors who had volunteered at the museum and at the dig site when she was studying, and headed there because it was I did not know there was a dig site as close to me while I was growing up in Georgia. Headed to Gray fossil site on a senior project, thought it was awesome, and applied for the master's program as soon as I was graduating. And it ended up there right after graduation.
So where were you at undergrad? Somewhere in Georgia, you said?
Little tiny college in North Georgia called Young Harris College. We had about 800 students total. And itty bitty. You could walk across the campus in 10 minutes.
Wait, your last name is Harris. So is this like did your granddad start this college, or like what happened here?
Yeah, I would always make the joke that it technically would be my brother. Yeah, it was in Young Harris College in Young Harris, Georgia, because teeny tiny. It was 30 minutes from North Carolina, and yeah, just a little liberal arts college. But it was close to home. It was a small campus, which I actually liked more than a big campus, and got to meet the right people, evidently, to get me to ETSU.
Nice. And I guess we should provide some context for why ETSU has this robust and prolific master's program. And I know we've probably talked about this on the show before, but ETSU has taken charge of the Gray fossil site, which is this amazingly productive fossil site in East Tennessee, up in the mountains outside Johnson City, near the town of Gray, Tennessee, if you can believe such a thing. And it's a site that was found when they were building a highway bypass. And the story, as I tell it, and you guys have actually attended there, so maybe you have more context, is that there are several garages full of rhino and mammoth and tapir parts from construction workers, and then at some point they decided to tell somebody that they were finding fossils, and the scientists came in to mitigate the site.
There's definitely truth in that.
We're not too far off. There is truth to that story. There's a lot of Gray site fossils on mantelpieces.
Yep, that's the way we would always say
around East Tennessee. But these days, it's all under control of the university.
Right. And so once it was acknowledged as this fossil site, the construction project was rerouted around the site. And then the governor, along with the university, actually put forward a significant amount of money to build a really awesome collections machine, essentially like this conveyor belt of paleontology in Eastern Tennessee, along with a really nicely done public-facing museum side, but also one of the best prep facilities I've ever seen, and one of the most convenient because, you're 100 yards from the dig site. So it's just become this amazing spot for anybody who's looking to get a really hands-on master's experience to go and do paleontology in East Tennessee.
It was really nice to be able to go dig for fossils and then just pop inside to go to the bathroom and go right back to digging to fossils. Just air conditioning 20 feet away. That was very, very nice.
It's also nice to be able to dig for 8 or 9 months of the year.
Yeah,
because you're in the middle of a town instead of in the desert somewhere.
Right, and it's also the land is controlled by the people running the dig. It's not, you're not asking permission from some private ranch land owner.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
And getting a few weeks to go get out whatever you can and hope you can afford a helicopter if you find something cool. This is like... Yeah, it's a totally surreal experience for people who've done field paleontology out west for any appreciable amount of time, because it's downright luxurious, as you kind of intimated with the air conditioning.
It is, and I say this on tours. I'm back at that museum currently, and I'm giving tours and doing educational stuff. And I say that on tours all the time. We are more than spoiled at this site. It's like the dream scenario for a fossil site.
Yeah, and I became familiar with it as a master's student at Vanderbilt, and so we didn't really have a field program at Vanderbilt, so whenever we were itching to get some time in the mud, we'd hit up Blaine or Wally and ask if we could come out for a few days and play around with whatever rhino or tapir, most likely a tapir they were digging up that week.
Yep. These days, it's all mastodon all the time.
Oh, really? Yeah. I guess I'm out of the loop a little bit.
Yeah, they found the rest of that elephant, turned out to be a mastodon, and now they've almost pulled out an entire skeleton.
Oh, wow. That's crazy.
It's insane. The whole lab is all mastodon now.
Oh, cool.
And
everyone's working on mastodon.
That started very shortly after both of us had left there.
Right after we left, like the summer season after we left, Sean texted, he's like, so we found the mastodon. What?
We both were messaging each other, just like, geez.
Well, Will, looking at your thesis, I see that it was a May 2015 thesis, so that's when you left. But while you were there, you mentioned briefly you were working on alligators. So can you tell us a little bit about the work you were doing?
So there was a trial period kind of at the beginning, figuring out exactly what thesis I was going to do. We had to figure out what we had on hand that was actually possible to do. Originally, I was going to do a 3D shape analysis, but the equipment we had to do that was not known. We did not have enough people who knew how to use it to accurately train me and Blaine on doing it. So we went to what my thesis ended up being, and it was a breakdown of the skull of the alligator, the snout and center of the back of the skull portion through ontogeny. So the growth series from as small as we had to as big as we had. We used every specimen we had on hand. And that's mainly what I was doing the whole time. And it resulted in that thesis. We didn't have quite enough for it to be immediately turned over into a publication. And to my chagrin, since then, I have not had access to enough baby alligator skulls to complete the study since graduation. Still something I would love to do, but it is remained as a dissertation and not a journal entry yet.
One thing I wanted to ask you, okay, so One of the things we like to do on this show is we like to read the title of a person's thesis or paper and then ask them to kind of break down the words that aren't necessarily common use words. So your thesis is
fun.
Ontogenesis in the cranium of alligator mississippiensis based on disarticulated cranial elements. So I have the words that I think need to be defined there, but I can let you just go first if you think you have a good idea of what needs to be explained in that title to make it in more understandable English. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. So the first word there is the ontogenesis of the alligator cranium. Ontogenesis is ontogeny, basically the growth and develop, the change throughout an animal's growth. And so that's what I'm studying, is how is it changing from growth? That could be no change, that could be lots of change. It's just dependent on the animal. And so that's the focus of the study. We were studying the cranium, the skull, the upper portion, not including the bottom, the lower jaw. We decided that was focus on the upper portion first, basically, and see where it took us before adding in every bone of the skull. Alligator mississippiensis is the American alligator found in North America from Florida to North Carolina and over to Texas. And disarticulated just means that we took the skull apart. And so instead of studying the whole skull, which has been done a bunch of times with just about every crocodilian out there, no one has really looked at the individual bones. And this could tell us two things. One, how are different parts of the skull changing in relation to each other? Is the front changing more than the back, or is this bone changing more than another? And it would be more beneficial to paleontologists finding alligator and crocodilian fossils, because it's usually not in a nice skull shape. It is usually single bones as the skull has fallen apart.
Were you looking at fossils from the Gray site for your thesis, or were these modern bones? Because alligator mississippiensis is an animal that's still alive, but we also have fossils of it.
These were modern specimens. We were wanting to establish growth series first, and then like down the line could have gone the fossil route, and it was the initial idea.
And in looking through the abstract of your thesis, which I believe, so Dave, you sent me a copy of this, but is this available online for folks to go check out as well as through the library?
Yeah, it's in the ETSU website. I actually re-downloaded this to make sure that I had the version other people would be finding, because I have my version saved in my documents, but I couldn't remember if I actually had saved the current PDF they had.
So in your abstract, you talk about using landmark morphometrics to assess this question of ontogeny. So can you tell us a little bit about what that method is?
Absolutely. This was probably one of my favorite things I got to learn how to do while at school, because I love morphometrics now. So landmark morphometrics in general is a studying in the shape of whatever it is you're studying. So your morpho space is, whatever shape your thing occupies. So you're looking at the shape. I'm looking at the change in shape. Landmark is referring to how we are looking at that shape. And there's lots of ways you can do that. But what we were doing is I was taking a picture of the bones from above, and I could have picked multiple angles, but I was doing it from above. And then I would put that picture into the computer and through a program, place landmarks, dots, on specific parts of the bone. And for each of the nasal bones, I would do it on the exact same points for every single bone. And then I run that through the computer. The computer is now looking at the points, not the picture. And that way the computer can understand, from what I've told it, the shape of the bone. And it will now tell me how these points have moved in relation to each other. It will group them by similarity. It can show me how they change through measurement. So I measured each one to tell me to put it into growth categories. And then I had it tell me how was it changing, what was the average shape. And you can do all sorts of stuff. I really only scratched the surface in what I did even, but you can do a lot with landmark morphometrics. And we were going to do 3D, where you actually use a pin on an arm to place those points. And it is measuring the movements, but we didn't know how to use that. So we were unable to do it, but the pictures still gave us some really cool findings.
The professors at ETSU were big fans of morphometrics. A lot of students around our time were using morphometric studies.
Okay.
It's a really cool way to categorize something that you can see similarities in, and this is a way to quantify those similarities.
So you're essentially
or differences.
Right, you're quantifying aspects of the shape that you can then compare across different skulls.
Yeah, it's putting it on a grid plane and literally mapping it out that way.
Something I noticed that you mentioned in your thesis was the idea of allometric growth versus isometric growth, and I was wondering if you could define those two terms and tell us, why that was a significant finding.
Basically, this is the concept that things can grow in different ways. You can either grow very stably to where you basically remain your shape, you just get bigger.
It's like a balloon inflating.
Like a balloon inflating. The balloon's not going from round to square to triangle. It's just big. It's a bigger balloon now, which is your isometric growth. And allometric is where there is change. It could be changes, a continual thing where something is getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, but the rest isn't. Or it could be shifts. You can have actually really complex.
Is like paths. Human puberty an example of allometric growth?
Yeah, and the fact that humans are shaped different as a baby versus when they're an adult. Like if you saw a person that had the same proportions as an infant but was 6 foot tall, it would be horrifying. Their head would be like the size of a medicine ball, like a yoga ball, and they'd have these short little legs and arms. And so it's that idea that your proportions are changing and you are no longer shaped the way you were. And most things experience some amount of that growth. It's very rare that you have an animal at least, that is just a carbon copy.
I mean, just imagine a person with a giant head and tiny hands who acted like a baby all the time. It'd be really bad if we put them in charge of anything. Anyway.
Like Will said, horrifying.
It's a horrifying image, not something anyone should ever be subjected to. So... as a non-reptile person, I would assume that most people, maybe even in the scientific community, assume sort of isometric growth in reptiles. That, we always hear that reptiles are born as just tiny versions of their adult selves and then just grow into a bigger size. But it sounds like you found that wasn't really the case.
Yes, and this has been known with alligators before my findings. Alligators look especially as new hatchlings, and alligators go through a interesting growth where they are, it's not like there are degrees of the change, but they are extremely allometric at the beginning. And then at a glance, they would seem isometric once they get to a certain age. Like they look like a little alligator now, but there are still changes happening. When they're babies, they have this cute little button duck bill instead of a long nose. It's very short, it's wide, and as is the case with most babies, big eyes, because eyes are complex organs. So it's hard to shift them as ridiculously in size as fast as other things. So big eyes. And body-wise, there are differences. They have proportionally longer legs as juveniles. So they are much better at hopping. They're also lighter, and gravity doesn't scale, so they can do some... They're very nimble as babies. I handle them at the aquarium now, and they are surprisingly quick. But eventually, they kind of hit gator puberty, where they shift from having this baby snout to a very adult-shaped nose. And that was one of the things I found in my study, is that once they hit that shape, the bones, for the most part, at least the two front bones of the snout, the major ones that bear teeth, the premaxilla and maxilla, basically stop changing shape. That they just grow isometrically. And this is the reason we want to do individual bones, is some bones showed, not completely throughout the entire life, but at portions, isometric growth, while others showed very, differentiated allometric growth. And there were some very interesting things there to see what was actually moving to change the shape of the face. And the big one that happens as they get older is their eyes get smaller proportionally. If you look at a big grown-up alligator, they just have these tiny little pin pricks for eyes, while baby alligators have these huge dots that
like a doll's eyes.
Yeah, it's like it. I've seen really big ones, and sometimes it is just like, where are they? They're just so small in there now.
And so were you a gator guy when you started your thesis, or was this something you picked up as you were working on your master's?
That was one of the reasons I went to ETSU, is I was digging at the fossil site, and they said, well, we have an alligator. I went, that will do.
Yeah, no, that is one of the most interesting things about the fossil site. One of the earliest, most interesting things about this site is the presence of cold-blooded archosaurs at a site in the Appalachian Mountains. So the site is was 5 to 7 million years old ish, and then so that's at a time when the Appalachian Mountains were still, in their more or less modern shape. So you're talking about a relatively high elevation and a relatively northerly latitude for something like an alligator. And so that was one of the first clues about what the climate might have been like at this site at the time that these bones were emplaced. So
to more thoroughly answer your question, you can't see because of the angle, and I know that we're recording, but I will turn it there. Back there in that corner is my crocodilian shrine, where I have...
All I see is Yoda.
So it's behind the Yoda.
Okay.
That the Yoda stuff is over on the other side.
There's definitely a Yoda there. Don't tell me that's not Yoda that I'm seeing.
Behind Yoda is all my croc stuff. I've loved alligators and crocs since as far back as I can remember, and I blame it on my first birthday cake being an alligator. So my mom had forgotten that. I remembered it.
So it must have been pretty cool to come up with a result that challenged one of the more fundamental assumptions about how these animals grow into adulthood.
Yeah, and there was some interesting ones because, the two big like cool things I found that really made me excited is that the premaxilla, the very front portion of the nose, it makes up half the nostril on either side, basically doesn't change shape from birth to death from what I could find. Like, it's just shaped like a premaxilla. It just gets bigger and the bones around it change, which was bizarre. I'd have to look into more and more to learn more about that and see if that's something that happens elsewhere. But the other cool thing is that whenever you hear alligators described as they grow, they say that their snout gets longer. And if you look at the face, it looks like that. The eyes start, almost midway in the snout when they're young. And then by the time they're old, their eyes are way behind the teeth. They're way back from the nose. And so it looks like their snout is getting longer, but if you look at the bones, what's actually happening is the eyes are reducing backwards. The bones of the snout are staying the same proportions, they're just growing with the skull. The eyes are slowly moving, the front of the orbit, the hole for the eye, is slowly moving backwards. And so really the snout's not lengthening because the teeth are not extending their length, or the teeth-bearing bones are not extending their length. It's just an illusion from the shape of the rest of the skull, which was really cool. And it doesn't upset the paradigm, but it is, we've always described that their snout gets longer, and it doesn't really. It's just that it looks like it does.
Isn't it said that you can measure, like, what is it, like eye to nostril distance or something to estimate the length of the full body?
Absolutely. The front of the eye to the back of the nose in inches, it should roughly be, when translated to, just taking the number of inches as number of feet, will give you a rough idea of the length of the alligator. And this is cited in hunting guides and field guides, and it's fairly accurate. Like I do it for fun whenever I see an alligator at different zoos and aquariums, and it'll get you within the ballpark. It's not going to get you down to the inch, but it will get you within a foot probably of what to expect. And it's mostly so that you can glance out there and go, no, that's probably 3 foot, or no, that's 10 foot. We should go. But that was one of the things I mentioned in my paper, was that this could affect that, that we even use this in our field knowledge of the alligator, is that their snout is longer, and really it's just their eyes are tinier.
I mean, that makes sense because what you're most likely to see of the animal when it's in the water is just the eyes and maybe the tip of the snout. And so if you can measure that length, you can get a sense of what the whole animal is like under the water. Well, that's cool.
It was a ton of fun. I did not quite have enough to publish it. And since I did not continue as a researcher, because as much as I loved finishing the thesis, the thesising part of it was very draining on me.
Yeah.
And I am an educator, I found out.
And so where are you now? You said you're at a zoo or an aquarium?
Yeah, I'm at the Florida Aquarium in Tampa. And so it's downtown Tampa, and I work as one of the full-time educators there, giving tours and doing boat tours and shows and stuff like that.
Awesome. My favorite fact about the American alligator is it is the loudest reptile.
Yeah.
Which makes it very American, in my opinion. It's just
right?
Yelling at everyone, making noise, getting in everyone's way. Yeah.
And they are, it's really fun to see what makes them make noise. So the babies chirp to communicate with the mom, but they will also do it because the other reason I went to work at a zoo and aquarium is I get to hold baby alligators now on the regular. But they will still chirp at you And at first it's like, I'm annoyed you're holding me because I'm a baby animal and I'm assuming everything bigger than me is going to eat me. But then eventually it gets to be a thing of, all right, I want you to put me down now. And it's funny because they'll keep doing that, but as they get bigger, their voice drops just like ours does. And so it goes from a to a and they're very talkative even with us. But the big alligators will bellow the rumbling mating noise that they make, even though they're females, which I didn't know they did until I worked there.
I didn't know that either.
Yeah. They'll do it to thunder. And we brought in a tuba player one time, and they'll do it for a tuba player too. We knew that was a thing they would do, but finally we got ours to bellow back at a tuba. So they're very responsive too, which is cool.
That is cool.
It's fun stuff.
I have one last question for you before we move on. And that is, do you have a hot take? This is something I ask all reptile people when they come on the show, or I try to anyway, especially people who do Archosaur stuff. Do you have a hot take on the whole alligators are living fossils?
Yes, I do. Oh my goodness.
Boy.
All right. So how long is this?
I was about to say, I'm going to go get a drink or something.
You have 15 seconds.
All right. No,
you have 3 minutes or however long it takes.
Right. Yeah, that is absolutely something I talk about. And it's one of those that's difficult. I balk at that term in general because it comes up at the aquarium all the time because we have a lot of aquatic stuff. So we have horseshoe crabs and animals that have shown up in the fossil record.
Horseshoe crabs. I hear those are living fossils.
Exactly. And it's crawling around. It's obviously alive. And that's one of those things I try to explain to people, that the term living fossil, first off, is not a technical term. Everything treats it like it's this stamp of approval we give a thing. And it's like, all right, put it into the vault of, with the rest of the living fossils. And I explained that it's a phrase to describe, and it's trying to say that it looks a lot like a fossil thing, or we found something, a relative of it in the fossil record that's very similar. Alligators, it's interesting because, like, as you said, we do find fossils of them, but we also find fossils of us. So, like, if you're using that as a measurement, we're living fossils. So just because you have a fossil of a thing does not mean it's not changed since ever. Mm-hmm. And the biggest way I use that is that crocs used to swim in the ocean. They used to run on the land. We have some that used to eat plants. We have some that may have had like a big pelican bill. We have one that even seems like it may have climbed trees. And so they've been doing weird stuff. They haven't been the same. Stop making it sound like they've always been the same. Is kind of my take home always, is that they've been crazy diverse. It's just that they all look at a glance pretty similar today because they're living in very similar, ecosystems, and they look a lot like a bunch of the ones from the past.
Right. But, so in terms of that crazy diversity, like maybe all of those weird, running around chasing stuff down on foot offshoots weren't the most effective lifestyle strategies for a cold-blooded reptile, but this sort of ambush predator at the water to land interface seems to be a very successful strategy. Mm-hmm. And so what I tell people with the living fossil thing is sometimes the decision not to make a change is still evolution. That's still an evolutionary process. And so it doesn't mean they're not continuing to evolve. It just means that their evolution is a maintenance of a strategy that works very, very well.
And the way I'll often say is that the water's edge body form is something you see in lots of other groups.
Ambulocetus and
Yep.
An early whale. Yeah.
Yep. You get a lot of those. You get a lot of the early big amphibians that had very croc-like body shapes. The phytosaurs, which look, startlingly similar to crocodiles, even with osteoderms, but are not. Is that lifestyle is probably just a very, convenient and stable lifestyle, whilst the others may just not be quite as. If things stable out, we may get to see running crocs again. But when the times are, I hope the opposite.
I'm on Will's side.
I have thought through which crocs I would breed if ever I went mad scientist and would make them. So it's one of my favorite things. But is that maybe if things, the ecosystem bounces back from the mass extinction that took so many of these big land animals, we will see these crocodiles branch out again. But when times are tough, go back to the water, because there's always food at the water because everything drinks.
Yep. Cool. Well, with that, David, what's your story, man? What are you up to?
Well, I'm just chilling here on this podcast.
Cool. Time for our next segment.
I started getting into paleontology also as a kid. I don't have a story that goes back to my young youth like Will does. But for me, it was just that I like a lot of kids, I cycled through interests. So I was into dinosaurs, then I was into space, and then I was into this and that. And by the time I got to high school, I realized that the one that always kept coming back was prehistoric creatures. And every time I went back to that interest, I would learn more stuff. You know, I had that moment, I was like, there's more than dinosaurs. And then I learned about that, and then this and that. And then in high school, I actually participated in a science competition, and I did a fossils event for Science Olympiad. And that was the moment where I was like, all right, I could do this forever. This is really cool. So I decided to go to college for that. And I looked for colleges specifically that had a paleo kind of focus in undergrad, which was very rare. There were like 2 colleges in the entire country that had like a specified paleo focus as an undergrad level. And I went to the exact opposite of a very tiny little college. I went to Penn State University Park, which had like 42,000 students. Jeez. It was enormous. The University Park has its own zip code. So there I studied, I started getting involved with the paleontology people over there. I studied with Dr. Russ Graham, who the mammal paleontologists all tend to have heard of. And they all, I went in with this sort of dreams of doing prehistoric reptiles. And of course, they didn't have, they were looking at Pleistocene, Holocene stuff. They didn't have dinosaurs. And one day I went up to Russ and I said, hey, everyone's got cool projects. Can I do a cool project? And he said, well, we've got all these snakes and salamanders no one's ever looked at. And I went, all right. And so my undergrad thesis was looking at the snakes and salamanders from this cave out in the Black Hills in South Dakota. And that is when I fell in love with the best group of reptiles.
Not according to the poll.
Which are the squamates. No, we'll have to do a recount. I demand a recount. And then I enjoyed that so much that I started looking for master's programs where I could do more small reptile stuff, Cenozoic reptiles. And I was introduced at SVP one year to Jim Mead, who had just moved over to ETSU. And that's how I ended up deciding to go there.
Cool. Yeah. Jim Mead is awesome. He's one of my favorite people to bump into every year at SVP. And just so we're abundantly clear, the salamander side of things are amphibians. The snake side are the reptiles.
Yes. I don't want to be unclear. Salamanders are amphibians. They're fine.
They're probably the best group of herps within the field of herpetology, which is a polyphyly, and so therefore not a valid taxon. But salamanders are amazing. It's not ours. It's not ours for life.
Yeah, this is controversial statement.
You cannot bring down a hellbender. So
I know some snakes that can do it.
The paper you sent me was from the Journal of Herpetology, and it is Late Hemphillian Colubrid Snakes Serpentes colubridae from the Gray Fossil Site of Northeastern Tennessee. So is this the publication of your master's work?
No. So I've been involved with a bunch of different research projects. My master's thesis was actually on a lizard from Eocene San Diego, an armored lizard called a Glyptosaurine, which were these sort of cool, covered in osteoderms, not too dissimilar from a croc, basically, that we don't have anymore. They're an extinct subfamily.
You say Glypto, and I, as a mammal person, I think Glyptodon, the giant armadillo-like animals that had armor plates.
Yeah, so these were small armadillo-like lizards, not to be confused with the armadillo lizards, which are still around today.
Our naming conventions are just the worst for actually making sense of any of this.
Oh, it's terrible. Yeah.
Even like scientific names, when you look at dinosaurs, the fact that the bird-hipped, bird-foot dinosaurs, the Ornithischian ornithopods, are extinct and are not modern birds. Like we botched it so hard so many times.
Every time I see somebody name a tax, like there's a Compsognathus and there's a Procompsognathus. Every time I see somebody do that, I cringe. I'm like, someone's going to discover that does not belong to that family, and then it's just going to be super confusing.
Well, there's also Basilosaurus, the whale that was thought to be a lizard.
Yes.
The sauruses that pop up all over the place are the ones that always make me laugh, where it's just like this croc is a saurus and that whale is a saurus, and sure are a bunch of sauruses running around.
Right. The most iconic group of sauruses, the dinosaurs, are not lizards.
Yep.
The lizard is a taxonomically specific term that's not even they're not even archosaurs, right?
No.
So
they are
archosaurs.
lepidosaurs.
Yeah, lepidosaurs. Lepidosaurs are the only valid sours. There, we're on record.
I agree. I stand by this.
Yes.
I endorse this message.
Okay, so tell us about the work you did in your master's, and then let's get into your paper here.
Sure. So yeah, the master's work was essentially just describing this specimen that had been sitting in a drawer at the San Diego Museum for a few decades, and no one had ID'd it. And I talked to Robert Sullivan, who had done a bunch of work on glyptosaurs earlier on. And he was talking to Jim one year at SVP, and he came up to me and said, "Hey, no one's looked at this lizard. You should look at it." So my master's project was just describing it in detail, identifying what it is. And that was essentially, it was a very straightforward little project.
Yeah. So then what led to you describing all of the snakes from the Gray Fossil Site? Because one of the things, I guess we talked about how cushy the Gray Fossil Site is as a quote unquote field site. But something that people who don't do paleontology might not realize is that a lot of times field paleontology, it's targets of opportunity based. So you're focused on the thing you went out to the field to get, and you maybe ignore some of the other possible things you could collect, especially in terms of microfossils or just going through all the sediment and screen washing and all that. But at a site like the Gray Fossil Site, where you can control the entire environment, you get the opportunity to find all of these more delicate and harder to find, still macrofossils, but maybe just more delicate, smaller, less likely to pop up in a broad overview. And so I'm assuming, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that's where a lot of these snake bones are coming from.
Absolutely. Yeah, the Gray Site makes a point to screen through. That is to say, we pour the remaining sediment on a screen, we wash the sediment away to get to all the little tiny fossils and rocks and stuff. We screen at the Gray Site everything.
Which is incredibly rare.
Which is insane. Yeah,
you might
no
be
site
the only
does that.
site that does that. And that's not an exaggeration. You might be you're definitely the only site I've ever been to. I've been to sites that put forth a very good faith effort, and no shade being thrown at anyone doing the work, but it's incredibly difficult to be as thorough as the Gray Site is capable of being.
I mean, we just recently caught up to the amount of sediment we produced from digging, didn't we?
Yeah, they, for a long, long time, because digging is faster than screening.
Right.
So for a long time, there were these piles of...
Is it, though, or is it just what paleontologists are interested in doing? One of those things is what you like doing. The other is a chore you have to do.
According to the official report, digging is faster than screening.
This piece of paper says I am supposed to... No.
Yes, but the law requires that I say that digging is faster. But for a long, we used to have this pile in the back of the site that was literally several thousand giant bags of sediment. And we have very recently managed... I
remember Blaine showing them to me, and it was getting a little dire when he showed it to me. Like, there were some that he was like, I'm not sure the plastic's going to hold that much longer, so we need to definitely get to this.
So very recently, we've been able to balance out digging rate and screening rate. So at the very least, we're not making more bags to work on.
It was a slow process because the sediment there is very dense clay, so it doesn't just wash away. You have to soak it, shake it, let it dry, soak it, shake it, and it takes like 3 or 4 sessions depending on how much clay there is, and it can really go slow unless you have a dedicated team. Which is
but it's not like it's humid in Appalachia, so you don't have to worry about that. It's going to dry up.
No, it's just beautiful all the time.
Sarcasm. Very.
So this project, all these snakes, there are hundreds of snake bones found at the Gray Fossil Site, mostly vertebrae because that's most of what the snake's fossil record is. That was actually
I'd literally written that down as a question. So it is mostly vertebral elements. And is that true for the majority of snake paleontology?
Yes.
Okay.
So snakes basically have 3 kinds of bones. They don't have legs, so it's either ribs, which are useless for identification, or it's skull bones, which are great for identification, but they're all barely, like they're very loosely connected in many cases. The skulls tend to be very delicate, so they don't fossilize very well.
Well, the reason, the thing we know about snakes is that they can swallow stuff that's really big, but the only reason we always say they can dislocate their jaw to do that, and that's because their skull is very kinetic. Their skull is the bones in their skull can move around in ways that mammal skulls, especially mammals like us that are super chewy, grindy teeth crunchy mammals can't do. But it also means that when the soft tissue rots away, those bones fall apart.
Yeah. I always correct people that they don't actually dislocate their jaw. What they do is cooler than that.
Yeah.
Their jaw just folds out in 5 different directions because of all those joints between the bones. But
like
yeah,
a predator.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, just. But it means you don't get a lot of fossil skulls. On the other hand, a snake can have 200 or 300 vertebrae, and the vertebrae are these little sturdy boxes. So the fossil record of snakes is just all vertebrae.
My dad and I are big fans of that scene from The Waterboy, where they're having dinner at his mom's house out in the swamps. Yes. And Henry Winkler asked Kathy Bates, which, like, also, what an impressive cast for a movie that is not memorable in any way. And Henry Winkler asks, like, what part of the snake he's eating. And Kathy Bates says, well, snake doesn't really have parts, but if I had to say a part, I'd say it was his knee.
Yep.
Yeah.
Such a good line. So I imagine that the gray site, much like the drawers at the museum in, you said San Diego was where the.
Mm-hmm.
So were they holding a lot of vertebra in need of a person interested enough to come examine them? Was that the situation when you rolled up, or what was the deal with this project?
Yeah, I mean, the gray site there are thousands of fossils and just continuously filling up more and more drawers, and we haven't looked at most of them research wise. So there's just this list that we need someone to look at these and someone to look at these. And my friend and colleague Steve Jasinski and I decided to look at the snakes. The story behind choosing this project was actually kind of fun because we took a paleoherpetology class, and we were both in the class together. And as part of the class, you had to do a project.
Is this at ETSU or where is this?
At ETSU, yep. Okay. And during the master's program. So we took this class, it was under Dr. Schubert, Blaine, who we mentioned before. And everyone had to do at least this little, at least a minor project as part of the class. And Steve studied turtles and I studied lizards and snakes. And we both already had talked to Jim and Blaine about doing certain projects. So Steve had a turtle project lined up and I had a snake project lined up. And then we were both kind of lamenting that we had the perfect projects for this class, but we were hoping to kind of do something different and not just do the same animals all the time. So we swapped projects. So Steve actually took sort of the lead on this snake project, with me backing him up as the guy who has actually worked on snakes. And we did the same thing with the turtle project, where Steve taught me about turtles so that I could do this Mexican turtle research.
Well, that's cool.
Yeah, so Steve and I went through all the drawers with all the snakes and looked at some. We actually have it in the paper. I should know this number. The number of vertebrae that we looked at was like 300 something ridiculous.
Not bad. The title of the paper is Late Hemphillian Colubrid Snakes, Serpentes colubridae, from the Great Fossil Site of Northeastern Tennessee. So hopefully we've fully explained, or at least sufficiently explained, what the Great Fossil Site of Northeastern Tennessee is, but there are a few words towards the front that might need a little explanation. Sure.
So late Hemphillian is the time frame. So the late Hemphillian is a North American land mammal age.
Which group of animals was that again?
Land mammals.
Yeah, mammals, the correct group.
Mammals. This is what they're good for, is making clocks.
They're good for everything. Shut your mouth. Some of my best friends are mammals.
I don't have any mammal friends.
So anyway, one of the ways we identified time period. So you've heard, I'm speaking to the audience now, but like you've heard Pleistocene, Eocene, Pliocene, those kinds of terms, and those are geologic ages. But there are also these things called North American and South American land mammal ages, which are based on biostratigraphy, where it's like what animals, in particular mammals, are found at what times, and those get cross-correlated across different various sites across the continent. So Hemphillian is one of those ages.
Yes, and it correlates mostly with the latter part of the Miocene epoch. So we're looking at, late Hemphillian puts us around 5 million years. Now, for a long time, that the official age of the gray site was 4.527 million years ago. But more recently, it's actually been refined down to roughly 4.5 to 5.
Nice.
So we might not even be in the Miocene. We might actually be in the early Pliocene. There's a very good chance. But yes, the late Hemphillian is just the time frame. So 5 million years ago or so. colubrid snakes. And the listeners can't see what the title looks like. But if you look at titles like this, we love doing this thing where we then put parentheses and put more big complicated words.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
So Serpentes colubridae. Serpentes is snakes, just the taxonomic designation of all snakes. Colubrids, the colubrid snake family, is a particular family of snakes. And basically, if you imagine a snake that's not hypervenomous and not a boa or a python, and you're probably thinking of a colubrid. Mm-hmm. Colubrids include corn snakes, rat snakes, water snakes, just your standard snake. Most snakes across North America that we're familiar with are colubrids.
Well, what's cool is, so when I was learning Spanish, I learned snake as la serpiente, which, serpent, right? So Serpentes, the taxonomic group you just mentioned, obviously is cognate with that. But another Spanish word for snake is la culebra, which I learned about when I was doing fieldwork in Panama, because there's a part of the Panama Canal that coils into like an S shape, and that's called the culebra cut, because and that is named after the way that snakes slither along the ground. So I that was how I first figured out that connection.
Cool.
Very cool. I think it comes from Latin originally.
Yeah.
Colubrid. I think so.
But I tend to think of colubrid snakes, and correct me if I'm wrong, I tend to think of them as the ones that like coil and asphyxiate prey, the constrictor types, more so than, like you said, they're not the toxic, the venomous type.
Yes. Most colubrids are constrictors. They're not boa constrictors. They're not large-bodied snakes.
Constrictor as a lifestyle, not constrictor as a group.
Yes. There are venomous colubrids, but they're typically not. They're venomous if you're like a shrew, but they're not dangerous to people.
And so I imagine the Great Fossil Site gives us better insight into the diversity and distribution of fossil snakes than many other fossil sites at this time, just based on how careful the collection has been.
Eventually, absolutely. Mm-hmm. We have tons and tons of snakes. This study, we were focusing on a very narrow band of the snake family tree.
Okay, and what did you find?
So we looked at, it's not even the colubrids, we looked at the large colubrids. We didn't actually look at the small ones. And the reason for that is because it was a class project. And Steve and I kept wanting to add more, and Jim and Blaine kept saying, stop. Just study these, because otherwise you will never finish this project.
How much of being an advisor is just pulling the reins back on eager students, right?
And they were probably right. Because we have viperids, right? Rattlesnake or cottonmouth type animals. We have what look to be boa vertebrae.
And we think that the Gray site was like a sinkhole site that might have been partially flooded at times. So like cottonmouths and stuff like, that's the environment you think of cottonmouths in today as like watery.
Yeah. So actually we should specify that. The Gray site is an ancient pond. So it was a sinkhole that became a pond. And it was probably a pond all year round. That you had just turtles and gators were living in there. The majority of our snakes that we find there are a group called natricines, which includes the water snakes. So they were very common at this site, which is probably reflective of the fact that this was a very aquatic habitat.
Cool.
But overall, we were able to identify 8 different snake taxa. And I'm actually going to pull up my list so I don't miss any, because that would be embarrassing. So when you're identifying snakes, we're not identifying them down to species for the most part, because you're working on vertebrae, and vertebrae can only tell you so much. Some people even like to argue about the genus designation. So we identified most of these to the genus. So genus, species, for example, Crotalus is the genus of rattlesnakes, but there's lots of species within that genus. So most of our genera that we found are the same genera you find today in North America. We have Nerodia, which are your water snakes. We have Thamnophis, which are your garter and ribbon snakes. We have what looks like Coluber or Masticophis, which are your racers and whiptail snakes. Pantherophis are your rat snakes. Pituophis is your bull snake or pine snake. So a pretty familiar North American snake assemblage, because unlike the mammals who change so dramatically that we can name ages after them, snakes have been fairly, at least as far as we could tell, fairly consistent over time.
They
You're
really
still
were living fossils.
Exactly, man. When I meet the jerk who came up with that term, the joke there is that Darwin came up with that term. And then there are two snakes that we found that are not living groups. One of them looks like an extinct genus called Neonatrix, which is another water snake that might be what we have. We put the little CF in front of it, which means maybe it's Neonatrix, but we're not committing to that identification.
What does the CF actually stand for?
I don't know.
Okay.
That's a great question. I don't remember what the CF. It means it doesn't even mean tentatively. I guess it just means tentatively, but I don't remember what the CF stands for.
That's fair.
And then the other one that we found is we identified as a new genus and species. So in this paper, we actually got to name a new genus and species of snake that has not that particular morphology, those particular features on the vertebrae have not been seen in any other fossil snakes that we know of.
I looked it up just to get clarification so we don't get emails, and the CF is Latin for confer or conferatur, meaning to compare. So
so similar to.
Yeah, so compared to, or conferring to. So.
Okay.
Right.
We'll rewind the tape and pretend we knew that.
So what is this new snake you described?
So we described a new snake, and we named it Zealantophis schuberti.
So Blaine was like standing over your shoulder when you were typing that part of the manuscript, and you just...
It's never too late to kiss up to the boss. No. Blaine is the director of the Gray Fossil Site Museum. He's one of the lead professors of the Paleo program. And he
most
was
importantly, a former guest on this podcast. Very
prestigious. And he was one of Steve and my two main mentors studying fossil reptiles. And Jim's got things named after him. So we were like, let's give Blaine something.
Jim has a fair number of things named after him.
Yeah. Jim's crazy.
He's prolific.
Not actually, but he's
done a little bit.
He has done just a bit. So yeah, the genus name Zealantophis, because we were trying to be clever, and it kind of bit us in the butt a little bit later on, actually. So when you're trying to compare these vertebrae, you're essentially looking for features you haven't seen before. And we found 7 vertebrae among the hundreds of vertebrae that we found at this site that just didn't look like anything else. And we compared them to modern snakes, and we compared them to fossil snakes, and we just didn't find anything else with this combination of features. So we designated it as new. And one of the features, the most prominent feature, was that if you look at a snake vertebra, there's all these, it's this little box, and there's these projections sticking out in all directions. And on the side, sort of the lower front side of snake vertebrae, they have these little knobs called diapophyses. And these are mostly probably for, muscle attachment and things like that. But the diapophyses in many snakes are these little knobs or these little bumps. But in this particular morphology, they were these broad slabs almost. They were looking down on the vertebrae. They were these sort of very broad projections. And it looked super weird to us because we'd never seen that in any other snake. So when it came time to name it, I said we should come up with something that invokes the idea of wings, because it's got these little sort of wing-like things sticking off the vertebrae. So Zealant is an Eastern European mythical flying snake creature. And we're like, that's cool. Let's name it that. Ophis comes from Greek for snake. So Zealantophis is named after this mythical flying serpent. Now, this was before I became a journalist. And then by the time this got published, I had some experience in journalism, and I immediately realized our mistake, because the press release said, quote, flying snake discovered at the Gray Fossil Site.
Oops.
And they put flying snake in the little quotes.
Yeah.
And it explained it. And then the next time I went to the fossil site, I went for SEAVP last year.
The Southeastern Association of Vertebrate Paleontologists annual meeting.
Exactly.
It's a small group of paleontologists that get together once a year. It's actually a very vibrant and wonderful group. I was sad I didn't get to go to the meeting this year.
It's
fun. I didn't go this year either, but I went last year. And last year it was hosted at Gray. But we were out on the site because, we give people a site tour because we're right there. And Wally was given a site tour, and I didn't go on the tour because I know the site. So I was just hanging out on the pit talking with some of the people like on the site when the tour came up. And while he kind of finished his little spiel, and one guy in the crowd raised his hand and said, "I heard they found a flying snake here." And while he turned to me, and I was like, okay, so me and Steve thought we were clever. And we named it this. It wasn't actually, because there are gliding snakes today, but there's no reason to suspect this was one of those. This was just a tiny little snake that happened to have weird shaped vertebrae.
Cool. Yeah. All right, I got two more questions for you. One is, in your paper, you said that this was a crucial time for snake evolution, this Hemphillian time. So what did you mean by that? Why is this period of time crucial for snakes?
So one of the big cool things that happened from the Paleogene to the Neogene, that is to say,
from when the dinosaurs died until now.
Yeah, pretty much. But right about the middle of the age of mammals, right? The start of the Neogene was like 20 to 25 million years ago. We start to see the spread of grasslands around the continents. And this is accompanied by this shift around the world in animal faunas, well, that's redundant, but animal, ecosystems of animals. And one of the things we start seeing as you go across the Neogene, the last 20 million years or so, is that the snakes changed around the world. So colubrids, that incredible ubiquitous family we were mentioning before, didn't used to be ubiquitous before that. So whether it was directly because of the spread of grasslands or what, they gradually took over a lot of, especially in the northern continents, snake faunas. And we also see the spread of the vipers at this time. Meanwhile, boas and pythons and such that used to be more widespread are kind of retreating down into the tropics. So what we're seeing here is a fossil site absolutely dominated by colubrids. So more than 90% of the fossil snakes we found at this site are colubrids, and almost all of the rest of them are vipers. So what it looks like is we are seeing perhaps the tail end of this world domination that modern snake families.
But I mean, aren't all snakes pretty much the tail end?
They are not. So recently,
I knew I was opening myself up for a rant, but I couldn't resist the joke.
Chris Pratt tweeted, "So snakes are mostly neck." And I responded to Chris Pratt and I said, "No, sir, snakes are torso, because they have specific neck features and they have specific tail features. And most of what's between that is the snake's body." Chris Pratt has yet to respond to me, the jerk.
I'm sure you will make a killing on your snake chiropractic business where you know how to work the different kinds of vertebra for the different kinds of snakes. So
you've got a subluxation between vertebrae number 137 and 138.
Very serious.
You shout down the room.
Seen this once before. So what? And you said you're a journalist now. So what is your current position now in the world?
So like Will, I got to the end of my master's and I said research was fun, but I don't know that I want to do research as my primary focus. So I've been sort of bouncing around different educational, communicational avenues. So I still do some science writing, but nowadays I am officially back on the education staff at the Gray Fossil Site.
Oh, great.
So they recently combined with the Hands-On Museum, which used to be in downtown Johnson City and then moved over. So now they essentially two museums in one.
Yeah, the local kids science museum that was in town.
Okay, gotcha.
So now the hands-on part, which is taking over all the floor stuff, all the education and the visitor interactions and such, we're looking for people. And I was like, you know what? I was in New York for a while and I said, well, boy, New York is expensive. Boy, I miss all my friends down at the fossil site and I miss all the fossils. So I scooted on back down here and I hopped back on the Gray site staff.
Nice. Well, much like a snake's torso, this segment has run long. So, without further ado, we are going to slither our way over to the drink segment and talk about what we are drinking coming up in just a second.
I know I'm going to find my paradise lost in the hills of Tennessee. I know I'm going to find my seventh heaven. It's just a cabin, my seventh heaven. There's a little angel waiting down there with a little prayer for me. And the sun shines bright in my lonely heart tonight. I know I'm going to find my paradise lost in the hills of Tennessee. In the hills of Tennessee.
So it would not be an episode of Science Sort of if we didn't also talk about what we are drinking. So I have a little bit of a spoiler here, in part because we're doing this on video and in part because I was in communication with you guys before. But as I understand, I will be the only one having an alcoholic beverage this evening. So we'll put me in the middle and we'll start maybe with David. And David, why don't you go ahead and tell us what you're drinking?
Sure. Yeah. Will and I are the strange breed of paleontologists who do not partake of alcohol. Not for any like philosophical reason. It just tastes gross.
Yep.
False.
So we disagree on a lot. It's a very tense episode. I am drinking my drink of choice, the good Dr. Pepper, which I actually went out and bought this so that I would have a fancy, unusual drink for this segment, because otherwise I'd just be having a glass of water. Because soda's expensive.
Dr. Pepper, of all the sodas that exist, though, is of my favorite. All those 23 flavors, which is the weirdest thing of like when they put out vanilla Dr. Pepper, I'm so 24 flavored Dr. Pepper. Like, why did you?
Yeah.
Why isn't the whole point of Dr. Pepper the egalitarian nature of all the 23 flavors? Like, why does one flavor ever get to take over?
Right.
As the
other 22 flavors had a fit that vanilla got top billing for that particular release.
No, I love a good Dr. Pepper. I've started using Dr. Pepper when I cook pork shoulder as a braising liquid.
Mm-hmm.
That sounds delicious.
Yeah, that with some chipotle, some of the adobo from the canned chipotles, and a little make that into a rub on the shoulder. Works well.
You cook much fancier than I can do.
Yeah.
We're gonna record at Ryan's house next time.
Cook fancier as I pour soda on a pork shoulder. Look,
yep. You
just like the French would do it.
When you were describing your meal, you did not say hot dog and microwave. So I mean, you're one up in me.
I start with the product that becomes the hot dog. And
right.
And
you have a pre-hot dog.
I've called the pre-hot dog. No intestinal casing need apply. All right, well, I said I would go next, and I will. I am having the Funkstarter. I'll hold it up. I feel like if I'm the only one drinking, it better be something that brings the funk.
Absolutely.
And this is a Scandinavian Saison. And according to the, it's a Bryggeriet product of Sweden. And according to the label, it gets its special character through fermentation with a mixture of different yeast strains, particularly those of the genus Brettanomyces. So I don't know how up you guys are on your yeast strains, but Brettanomyces is an undomesticated wild strain of yeast. So it's like it's the wolf of the yeast world. If all their yeast are cute little puppy dogs, this is the wolf coming in.
Rebel without a cause.
Funkstarter is a maverick.
Yeah, no, and it gives them like a very funky flavor. It's kind of like the difference between a very mild like Swiss cheese and like a super funky blue cheese. Like that's sort of the flavor profile. And so we'll go ahead and give this a taste here.
Interesting. Yes.
Yeah,
Tell us how it is.
If we had a cheese section, I could weighed in on that one.
I gotta say it's actually pretty mild for a Brettanomyces beer. It must be that Scandinavian
chill,
like stability, like they just keep it level.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. That relaxed. It's a very neutral beer.
Mm-hmm. Will, what are you having?
So I was very hungry on my way home, so I had to get food. I drank my Dr. Pepper already because I did not get to have a big lunch at work. So I am having a lovely bottle of tap water.
How is the Tampa tap water?
That's fine. I grew up with a Eagle Scout who was in the National Guard, so I've never understood the aversion to tap water. Like my dad was very much one of those who was like, it's water. Put ice in it if you want it to be cold. And that's how if I want it to taste better, I make it cold. So yeah, it's fine here.
Do you guys ever really splurge and get the Dr. Pepper in the glass bottle, like with the real sugar?
Not usually.
No, I've gotten it on road trips. Like that's when I get the majority of my sodas is when I'm in gas stations and I get the glass bottles or stuff like that. I don't buy a lot of sodas for my home because I go through them too quickly.
If you have them, you'll drink them.
Yep.
I'm the same way.
I drink soda at work. I have a whole bag of I had a whole bag of quarters in my cubby at work for the Coke machine whenever I was feeling like I needed a little extra sugar to get me through the day.
Well, actually, something I forgot to ask both you guys in the previous segment, but maybe it's more relevant to the consumption segment. Will, do you eat gator? And David, have you ever eaten snake?
Yes.
I had the chance once and I did not take it.
Oh, no. I've had python jerky.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. It was
Steve and I wanted to make python jerky out of that python we dissected, but we ended up not doing that. It was sick with something terrible. Would have been a bad idea. I was in Beijing several years ago, and there was this tourist trap alley, essentially, where they had all these foods, like foods you could that still had eyes. And it was like fried grasshoppers and fried scorpions and fried lizards and snakes and stuff like that. And I tried the bugs. They don't, and for clarification for our Western listeners, most of the people in Beijing were not eating these things. This was specifically for tourists to come by and go, I ate a snake in China. The snakes looked sketchy. I was like, you fried the entire thing. That seems like an odd thing to do. I'm going to pass. I'll eat the grasshopper because I'm not expecting to swallow bones.
Right.
So you did eat the grasshopper?
I did. I ate the grasshopper and the scorpion.
I've had grasshopper tacos a number of times, and
yeah,
they're good. They're fine.
They were like chips. They were fried. It was like potato chips.
Yeah,
I had crickets
shrimp
that were fried. Yeah. I have actually eaten 2 species of crocodilian, because I have had American alligator a number of times, because being an Arkansas, I don't know if this is the reason, but I like to think it is. It does taste like chicken, but it is like chicken steak. It's got
meatier.
The texture. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
meatier. And usually, because it's where you're eating it, you get it with Cajun seasoning. It's everything Cajun seasoned is awesome. But I also did a student ambassador trip to Australia when I was turning 13. And got to have saltwater crocodile soup.
Ooh.
Which is like the saltwater taffy of the crocodilian.
Right. And surprisingly, tastes a lot like alligator. Yeah, who would have thought?
I'm shocked.
I've had gator in like Cajun meals.
Yeah.
I think that's the only reptile I've eaten.
I've had gator, and I had turtle soup in New Orleans, and I had a friend who would make turtle soup from scratch with turtles that she had collected.
Interesting. I've never had that.
No, neither have I. We used to talk in grad school about eating our study subjects.
I was the one who won the hardest because I was studying a modern animal. So everyone else had come close. I had dominated my animal. I had consumed
You've
it.
eaten this species.
This will help me write the thesis I will absorb.
This is a good time for me to plug that when I was doing the live stream Sloth Q&A for your guys' podcast, which we're about to talk about here in a moment, I was asked about eating sloth. And so I did provide a few ideas for a sloth recipe, even though I myself have not eaten sloth and don't think it would be very good.
I wouldn't suspect so.
No.
It's all slow twitch muscle.
It's just, with not enough fat to make it. You'd have to add a lot to the party, but that's all I'll say, and you can go listen to that. And we're going to talk about your guys' podcast here in the next segment coming up in just a second.
I drink Dr. Pepper and I'm proud. I'm part of an original crowd. And if you look around these days, there seems to be a Dr. Pepper craze. I'm a pepper, he's a pepper, she's a pepper, we're a pepper. Wouldn't you like to be a pepper too? I'm a pepper, he's a pepper, she's a pepper. If you drink Dr. Pepper, you're a pepper too. Be a pepper, drink Dr. Pepper.
So the reason that I originally became aware of you guys is because you have a podcast.
Yes.
Indeed we do.
And it is called the Common Descent Podcast. And why don't you guys tell us a little bit about your show and maybe the origin story of your collaboration in the podcasting space?
Sure. So Will and I met at ETSU. Will started a little bit after I did and graduated a little bit afterwards. But in the time, we became fast friends after. Actually, we met and then I forgot about you and then we met again.
Yep.
And then we became fast friends. And we stayed in touch after we had both sort of gone off in different directions. And I had been listening to a lot of podcasts. And whenever we got together, we would
Which ones?
Science, sort of, just all the time. That's the only one. Just that all
That
those.
sounds like a lie.
It is a lie. I didn't know who you were for a long time.
That's fine.
I did actually. I put together a list of paleo podcasts at one point, and Science sort of was on that list. So
Nice.
I dabbled early on. And I would listen to podcasts, and then Will and I would talk about geeky, sciencey stuff just as just friendly conversation. Mm-hmm. And eventually I was like, dude, we should do a podcast. Yep. We should just do what we're doing right now and record it and see if anybody cares to listen to it.
Nice. And
so we did. And as it turns out, a surprising number of people like to listen to us geek out about science stuff.
Yeah.
Is the show as it exists, the Common Descent show? So for people who haven't listened to it, the typical episode, at least from the ones I've listened to, are you guys do some paleontology news topics, but then you have a bigger overarching theme that you then shift to for the latter half of the show. And that can range from everything to the fundamentals of paleontology to discussing a specific group of animals or plants or whatever within paleontology to your most recent episode, which was on speculative evolution, which I thought was just a hilarious but awesome idea for a show. So how did the format kind of come about? Where did that come from?
We had a couple of main goals when we were wanting to make this podcast. First was to educate, to be able to continue being educators in the style of how we would talk about stuff anyway. But also was to keep up with and keep contact with the scientific community, because we had both noticed after leaving school and not continuing to be, tied up and involved with a lab, that we were not as in touch with the updated science, and we were losing a little bit of our knowledge here and there where things were getting fuzzy, and we both wanted to still keep learning and keep up with the science, but it's hard to do that without a driving force. And that's part of the reason we added the news section. We thought it was important to be able to translate science news that can sometimes be great, sometimes be misleading in some of the posts that are put up, but also so that we would be forced to read news articles and keep up with it. And we decided to put it up front so that it would have to happen and it would never be just left by the wayside at the end. Yeah. And then we had a discussion also on what would the main subjects really entail. And that's actually broadened quite a bit from our initial beginnings, and it's expanded into more abstract and more specific topics than we had initially. We knew we would eventually get to those if we kept going, but we thought it would be way down the line that we were doing weird, eclectic things like speculative evolution, but people started asking for those, so they started coming up.
Yeah, the idea was that we would take a topic and say, because the other thing we have as a benefit to the both of us is that we have expertise in paleontology. So what we can do is talk about a subject. How would paleontologists talk about this subject? Like when paleontologists talk about crocodilians, episode 2 of our podcast was all about crocodilians. What are we thinking about? And so the episode was, all right, what makes them unique today and what's their fossil record like? Our next episode, spoiler alert, which will be coming up very shortly, is about Madagascar. Mm-hmm. And it's, what do paleontologists think about Madagascar? What's the history of it? Why is it interesting from a biological or Earth history perspective? So every episode is a subject just from the paleo point of view, with two people who are kind of geeking out about it along the way. And early on, it was whatever we wanted to talk about. But very quickly, it became apparent that our listeners had enough ideas that we have more than half of the episodes of the podcast now have been listener requests. And we haven't done our own idea. The next episode will be episode 40. And the last time we did our own idea, I think, was episode 22.
That sounds right.
I mean, that's awesome,
it's just all requests.
Oh, yeah.
It's excellent.
Wonderful. The suggestion list dwarfs our original ideas list, and it's fantastic.
Well, I was going to ask about that in terms of what the reception to the show has been, but it sounds like the reception has been very passionate.
We've had some really cool interactions. We had moments where it was very quiet, and we would get people every now and then be like, oh, neat. And we're like, oh, that's neat too. It's neat that you think it's neat. But then from time to time, we would get these people who would give these long descriptions on how they were enjoying it. And we've had some really cool interactions. Still on the top of my list is we got fan art from one of our listeners early on who drew Zool, the ankylosaur that was discovered last year now.
This is a 5-year-old.
This is a 5-year-old.
Or at least he was at the time. He's probably not 5 anymore.
Yes. He gave us a cartoon piece of a crayon piece of artwork of Zool, and it says at the top, "To Common Descent" by Darwin, his name. And it's awesome. And so that kind of stuff that started happening, and we were like smitten.
That's amazing.
The whole sloth live stream we did, our episode 24 was about sloths. And then afterwards, one of our Twitter followers said, you guys should talk to these people about sloths.
Yes.
And Ryan was one of those people.
Yeah, I also noticed that Robert found your blog post and started commenting.
He
Robert.
did, yes. He snuck in there. So that whole live stream was because of a listener.
Well, hang on. I have to point out that I'm pretty sure the mislabeled sloth he was complaining about, I think I even tweeted a photo of that sloth and mislabeled it on purpose to make fun of the fact that it was already mislabeled. So I think I'll show you guys. The listener will not be able to see it, but I'll put this photo in the show notes. But I tweeted look, a megalonyx, and it's an Arctotherium or an Arctodus, or it's a cave bear. But I tweeted it as look, it's a megalonyx. And Robert was so annoyed with me. He was like, Ryan, you're putting that out there on the internet, and everyone's gonna see it, and you're just gonna confuse people. They're not gonna get the joke. And I was like, I think at first he thought that I was dumb enough that I thought it was a megalonyx. I was like, Robert, I know it's not a megalonyx. But then he was like, well, you're just confusing everybody else. I was like, I know, I don't care. But he cares, and because he's a good person, and so he's on it when it comes to sloths, and he was able to I give him more credit than I take myself for getting getting our slothologist side of things onto the live stream. But that was a lot of fun. So essentially you did an episode about sloths, and not because there was anything wrong with it, but because sloths on the internet tend to be a kind of passionate subculture. There were enough people saying, hey, keep talking about sloths, but talk to these people, that we were able to do a live stream where we did a 90-minute Q&A just about sloths.
Yeah.
Yeah, we collected questions from beforehand. We had some people live. It was meant to be Ryan and Robert and Dr. Becky Cliff, who got landslided out of the live stream, unfortunately.
I've never been able to get Becky on this podcast either, so people might know Becky from some of the documentary work she's done and like that, but Becky is someone I've collaborated with for a number of years, and she and I talk almost daily, and I still can't get her on the podcast, so I suspect she might have planted some charges to make that landslide happen, to make sure she wouldn't have to go
suspected.
on that. Yeah.
I can't break my record.
And she's not here
reputation to uphold.
She's not here to defend herself, so take that, Becky. But yeah, no, that was a lot of fun. I mean, you guys have a very informed listener base, it seems. You're not your average podcast fan.
It's really cool. We have a very interesting mix, because we'll get some people who are like, I had never heard of this thing before. How interesting, and asking us to explain scientific concepts. And then other people coming in, it's like, what are your opinions on this very specific fossil? And it's really interesting, because every now and then we get questions where they're like, what is your stance on this? And we're like, we don't have one because we don't know enough.
Yes. Or sometimes we'll get someone who will say, hey, I was super happy you did an episode on this topic, which is the subject of my master's thesis. And I'm like, whoa, okay. Cool. Well, don't ask us any questions, because you know more than we do then.
I'm glad you think so. We're done talking now. Bye.
That was everything we knew was in that episode. That's it.
That's usually when I challenge people to come on the show. I say, oh, well, if you're such an expert, come talk to me about it on the show. And they're like, oh, I don't care that much. Bye.
We have done that twice. Yeah. We've had people. Our first guest was our friend Ethan, who after we touted the superiority of our reptilian favorite animals, he argued, because he is a primate guy. So we said, come on the show.
I would say we're all
defend thyself.
Yes,
how dare you, sir? I resent that. I'll unhinge my jaw right here, right now.
All right, whatever you say. Oh no, I'm forgetting what's our skull type that we're different from. We're not diapsids, synapsids. Whatever you say, synapsid.
I'm gonna get surgery to fix that. I'll punch two holes in up here.
Copperhead.
So you guys have covered a wide breadth of topics. Are there topics that you have felt you were the most excited to talk about? I'm not going to ask if you felt like you've done the best job, but just what was the most eager beaver thing that you covered?
So there's been a couple that come up. This last one is probably my favorite so far. And
Madagascar or the speculative evolution?
The speculative evolution that just came out.
Because you guys are sci-fi nerds too. Like,
yes.
Yeah, so that's clear when you listen to the show.
Yeah, and I love those kind of those evolutionary brain games. I love that stuff. I have an entire book of the like written as a field guide, the wildlife of the Star Wars universe, and it goes through the behaviors and anatomy, and I love that kind of stuff. To me, that's the most fun form of creative thinking in fiction. So that was definitely a fun. I can't say whether I can think of a topic that will top it. I am hoping that we will just get to keep doing versions of it like we did with our little bonus mermaid episode that we followed that up with, because if I could just keep bouncing through other things and doing that idea, I'd be completely happy.
Nice.
Yeah, I was early on. We did a Crocs and Snakes episode. We usually take turns leading episodes. But I think my favorite, the thing that I always look forward to the most now. Recently, we did two back-to-back episodes on ancient DNA and de-extinction, and that was super exciting for me.
De-extinction's a personal favorite of mine.
Yeah, it was a fun one.
It's a fun topic, but we've actually accidentally created a tradition where we do regular extinction-themed episodes. We did the KPG, we did the End Triassic, we did the End Pleistocene, and that has become one of my favorite, because I always do the extinction episodes. So that has become the thing that I always look forward to, is doing the next extinction episode.
Yeah, we did the first two, and David looked back at one point, and then as we were coming up on the next episode, he said, hey, so we did 2 extinction episodes. It was episode 5 and 15. The next couple episodes, we have another 5 ending episode coming up. Do we want to make this a thing?
Yeah.
And it just kind of,
if we do it on 25, it's a tradition.
Yep. The 3 makes it a trend, and stuff like that has popped up, and that's been a lot of fun when those little traditions can kind of come around.
Yeah, no, I have found that as well in doing our show. And when people ask about the format of the show, I like to say that it's an intended intelligent design that still falls prey to selective pressures when things aren't quite working right.
That's phenomenal.
There you go. That is a really good description.
It only took me 287 episodes.
very, very good. You gotta warm up to it.
Hey, you need some run-up room.
But speaking of maybe the 6,000-year-old elephant in the room, we all did paleontology in Tennessee. And now we are public science communicators promoting the idea of paleontology and evolution and deep time in the public sphere. Have you guys run up to any challenges in putting this material out there in terms of maybe pushback from people who aren't as on board with the deep time evolutionary perspective that the 3 of us have?
Surprisingly? No, not at all.
Really.
The only 2 times we ever got anything bordering on confrontational, we got a comment after we did a Women in Paleontology episode, which got into some social things that
Do
we got.
Do people not like women on the internet? That's weird.
Right.
I was surprised.
Were you really surprised though? Because
no, I was not. I was not surprised at all.
We were. It was almost that moment in the movie where they're like have their hand hovering above the button, where we were like getting ready to submit it, and we both were like, "This could be our first episode we get some interesting comments on."
Yeah. Well, anytime you touch on socio-political issues.
Yes.
And I know, like, someone's going to have an opinion that they're going to, and it wasn't a vitriolic response.
Yeah, it really wasn't that bad.
But there was that, it was the first time it was one of the very rare times that we've got someone say, I have complaints about things you said.
Yep.
And the only other time we ever had something close to it was David Peters commented on our blog once.
And I know who David Peters is, but for the listener, do you want to explain why that is significant?
David Peters, the best way to explain it is to tell you to Google David Peters tetrapod zoology and read what Darren Naish wrote about him.
Yes,
but
that's a good one.
Essentially, he is a person who maintains a very high-profile website where he spreads the word of his research.
Right.
Where
His
he
website
claims,
is like pterosaurevolution.net or something like that. Don't say it. I'm gonna bleep your.
Oh, you can cut that. Absolutely, you can cut that out.
No,
if
but
you
I mean,
want.
I know
I don't blame
we've had David Hone on before, who's very anti David Peters, and he's talked at length about the problems with the work that the quote unquote work that he's promoting.
Yeah,
but yeah, he has a very he does the thing that a lot of pseudoscience practitioners do, where he covers everything in a veneer of scientific trappings, but it's nonsense. And so it's very difficult.
That's what I was gonna.
Yeah, it's difficult if you're not trained in it to distinguish what he's saying from actual science if you don't know how to look for what's wrong with it, you know?
It has the aesthetic of a publication paper.
Yeah.
Yes.
But
Which this is the thing that annoys me. You only do that if you're trying to be deceitful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There is truth to that. Or you do it when you can't publish elsewhere.
Yeah.
You make quote publications.
You don't put in the effort unless deception is the goal. And so like if you actually think that your results are correct, you wouldn't purposefully try to make it look like something it wasn't. You would just trust that your results would win out in the grand view of history. That's my opinion anyway. I don't know.
Yeah. But he's a very controversial figure, to say the least.
Yeah, it was very interesting.
He's controversial, and he figured out SEO in a way that is very frustrating to people actually doing pterosaur science. So.
Yes, but that's the closest we've gotten to, and even that wasn't particularly controversial. That we haven't.
And you guys didn't have any issues while you were in Eastern Tennessee, because Gray. I mean, Johnson City is not exactly a giant urban center, and Gray is even further out in the sticks. So there were no issues. Because when I was doing my master's at Vanderbilt, that was when the academic freedom bill was being pushed through, which is not really academic freedom. It was just allowing people to not teach evolution if they didn't feel like it. And so I was part of the effort in Nashville to push back against that. And I was just curious if you guys had any similar experiences in a different part of Tennessee, Tennessee being notoriously the buckle of the Bible Belt. So sort of a hotbed for those sort of ideas.
No, if you're going back before the podcast, there definitely were moments at the museum while we were both there, because we both worked at the museum as tour guides, and David went on to fill administrative roles for a little while there. And so we both did tours for quite some time there. We both did outreach there. And we had a number of times where typically whenever we mentioned the age of the site, we would have changes in body language of someone on the tour. Because we could talk about everything else in a way that was digestible, but there was really no way to get around that it was millions, not thousands. And that was usually where we would lose almost someone every tour. Like there was almost always some face that would crinkle just a little bit.
But even in all the time I gave tours, I never had an actual confrontation.
A hateful.
Anybody get angry. I had a woman come up to me afterwards, after the tour once, to explain to explain how it made her feel to hear me saying all this stuff. And then she handed me a little piece of paper and said, "You should go to this website." And I politely took it. And it was the Institute for Creation Research, which I went to, and I went through it, and it's horrendous. But that's, I think, the most confrontational I ever saw someone get. Usually it's facial expressions or a sigh. That lady sighed very heavily.
Yeah.
I said 5 minutes. She went, and looked around at the tour group, but they didn't say anything. I was like, all right, on with the tour.
Yep. We'd get a lot of we'd get a lot of very tactical questions of, couldn't all this water be here for some sort of flooding event?
Yes.
Things like that.
Or how can you? Isn't there carbon in the soil that contaminates your carbon dating? Yeah, that's a very specific question, 10-year-old.
Yeah.
And no, we don't do carbon dating. Here's a whole bunch about radiometric dating.
We got there after the times when they had to do regular patrols through the museum to pick out all the pamphlets that would be sprinkled throughout.
Oh wow, people were leaving pamphlets
during the early days. This was before our time. I only had one pamphlet show up my entire time being there, but they would just seed them, just like an Easter egg hunt throughout the bathrooms and the gallery. They would put pamphlet, and they would have to just do regular rounds and collect them. I know someone at one point had collected all the variations that had made their way through, but I don't know if that still exists.
I mentioned before we started recording that I have been to the Creationism Museum in Northern Kentucky. And I will just go ahead and reiterate, because it comes up every time creationism comes up on the show. We are specifically talking about young Earth creationists. We're not talking about any other group of Christians out there. This is young Earth creationists, because I know that is something people take very personally and take very seriously. And so clarity is key, and that's who we're talking about. And so the Creationism Museum in Kentucky promotes, it's all about flood geology and it's all about age of the earth stuff. Like, those are the two things that they push harder than any other topic. And I went a number of years ago, but I have heard that their attendance has actually dropped off significantly because they haven't updated the exhibits, because it turns out when you think you've got everything correct, you don't have to update it. And so there's no reason for return visits.
Oh my goodness, what an incredible metaphor.
Isn't that hilarious?
for holy cow, that's incredible.
That's real.
So I presume this exhibit is still there, and they literally have an exhibit that is a wrecking ball labeled millions of years, and it is swinging through the cornerstone of a building, and the cornerstone of the building is labeled foundation of the church. And so they are promoting an idea that if you accept the millions of years age of the earth, and I hate to tell them that it's billions, but if you accept even the millions part of it, it will literally destroy the foundation of the church. Now, I don't remember Jesus talking about geochronology at all, but somehow this has become a very important topic for them. And then, the flood geology stuff is just, they have track fossils of, just like basic, very simple, very pretty, very well-preserved trackways fossils of just, a lepidopsaur scurrying along a sandy bank or whatever. And the fossil is labeled lizard escaping the rising floodwaters. They specifically say that this was a Noachian event that was occurring. So it's kind of crazy. So I was just, it's, I guess, I don't know if it speaks to the self-selection of podcast listeners, or maybe there are bigger fish to fry right now than the creationism versus evolution agenda that was kind of important maybe 5-10 years ago. And so I'm just curious to hear your guys' perspectives there.
I assume anyone who is not on board with evolutionary science checks out at common descent and the evolutionary tree and the logo. Like, I assume we don't keep those listeners very long.
So you structured it in a way where you're going to filter it from the get-go.
Yeah, perhaps unintentionally.
Yeah.
But it's a podcast about, I think evolution is, we mention evolution every episode because obviously it's paleo. I don't remember if evolution's in the description, but it's pretty prominent. So I assume people don't stick around very long if they download us.
Yeah, we were very clear when we were originally formatting it that we wanted to be able to we were going to talk about science freely. Because when we were doing tours, we would select our words sometimes. Instead of saying evolution, we might say adaptation and things like that on a tour, because why use the buzzwords if we can still have an interesting conversation with a person on there? On the podcast, we wanted to have clear discussion about science and not dance around scientific topics because of any of that.
Yes.
Cool. And so what do you guys see as the future of the show? Where do you hope to take it moving forward? What's kind of the plan there?
Oh, geez.
To do it all the time?
Yeah, that'd be nice.
That's like it. We both discussed it. This is what we would love to turn into a business that we can do, and expand it into something that is a business we could make our lifestyle. Right now we are working other jobs to support ourselves while we do it. But this is definitely something that we want to grow into something bigger.
We are actually in a very experimental phase right now, because this year we've been trying out a bunch of different things. We did the live stream. We did in June a Jurassic Park movie science series.
I saw that.
That was super fun.
Oh my gosh.
We've got another special project coming up later this year. We are officially, if this is coming out as soon as it is, this will be, we can say this here and it'll actually come out on this podcast before it comes out on our podcast.
Ooh, exclusive.
We're making our first public appearance later this year. We're going to be at Dragon Con.
Oh, awesome. In Atlanta?
Yep. And we have enough patrons now that we have recently put out a call for our patrons to say, hey, what do you want to see more of? You've seen all these different things we're trying. So the future of the podcast is a little bit, there's a whole bunch of roads ahead of us and we have to choose which ones we want to focus on.
Or at least which ones we want to do first.
Yes, exactly. So we might do more video stuff. We might do more side series. We try to be listener driven as much as possible and ask like, what stuff do you want to see us do? And if it's something we also want to see us do, then we'll do it.
Yep.
Well, that's cool. That was definitely something I was going to mention because our show is on Patreon and it's been a fundamental shift in the way we do the show to have ourselves on Patreon. And so I definitely wanted to make sure I plugged that you guys are on Patreon as well. And so if you are a Patreon supporter of our show, consider going and supporting you guys as well, because we're all pushing towards the same goal of science promotion, science outreach, but also like science excitement, I think is something that our shows share in a way that I don't always get from other science shows, is just like the fundamental yippee-ness of it all, if that makes sense. Yeah.
We have both long held the belief that any topic, when talked about with the right people, is fascinating. If you talk about just about any topic with someone who is passionate about it, it is a fascinating topic. And science is absolutely no exception to that. I have had the realization back when I watched a documentary on ducks, just ducks, and it was an amazing documentary that every animal could have its own documentary if it was written by and led by someone who truly was passionate about that group. And it's all exciting if you just look at it the right way and know how to look at it, where to look.
And one of the cool things for us in our podcast, now that we do almost pretty much exclusively listener requested topics, we like the next episode is Madagascar. I didn't know anything about Madagascar.
Yeah.
So I had to learn about, obviously I have the paleo background to be able to put it together quickly and explain it. Yeah. But when we do episodes now, like Will did a reefs episode recently, and it was about reefs through time. And I was sitting and on my side of the Skype call, like chin in my hand, like really this is fascinating. So we are exploring these topics at the same time that our listeners get to explore them. And that's just, we get to learn so much doing this podcast, and we love that experience.
It's fun when they give a suggestion. It's like, oh, I know the words you're using, and that's about it. So
yes,
this will be a fun trip.
Awesome. Well, Plug Corner, give people listening to this everything they need to find and connect with both your podcast and the website, and then you both as individuals and just whatever people need. Obviously, I'll include links in the show notes for the episode, but just go ahead and tell everyone right now so they have that in their earbuds too.
We are the Common Descent podcast. That's common, like common place, and descent. Yes, exactly. Descent as in the descent, like the movie with the caves.
Yeah, just like that. That's just the vibe we're going for.
It's a good movie. It's Kentucky, not Tennessee, but it's a good movie.
It actually was. We did a scary cave movie night with our friends when we were all in Tennessee, and it's actually surprisingly good.
I had the opportunity to take some recent high school graduates into a undeveloped, like not at all touristy cave recently, and one of the students said, like, at a certain point to me, they were like, "You're remarkably cool for." And they didn't mean cool in like rad or awesome. They meant like cool in like not freaking out that I was just leading a bunch of high schoolers into a cave. and I just like leaned over and quietly whispered like, "Oh, I'm freaking out right now because all I can think about is that scene in The Descent where she shines a flashlight and nobody else sees it and the thing walks by and blah." And I was like, "Well, look at the time. We have to get out of this cave." And then
look at the sun. It's time to go.
Well, you couldn't see the sun. And then we get out of the cave and I see, and this I'm not kidding. I'm not trying to make light of this. We get out of the cave. I have cell phone signal and I see that like 12 Thai boys trapped in a cave. And so I'm just like, oh my God, I'm so glad we only stayed in for a few minutes. And I'm glad all those kids and their coach got out.
Yes.
But it was just like, I could have been the American version to that story. if I hadn't been freaked out by the movie The Descent.
That's right. Elon Musk would have come to save you. He would have driven his space Tesla right into that cave.
And I might have politely declined.
Send the next billionaire. The next one. Bring me Bill Gates.
Are you here to tell us who's coming next?
I want Bezos or better.
So we are the Common Descent Podcast. We are hosted on Podbean, which is a podcast hosting site, but you can find us on iTunes or anywhere you get your podcastery. You should be able to find us. You can follow us on Twitter, Common Descent Podcast, at Common Descent PC. You can find us on Facebook. Just look up Common Descent Podcast. We also have a blog at WordPress, commondescentpodcast.wordpress.com. Every episode gets a blog post where we throw up fun pictures and links for more information for people who want to dive in deeper. Or if we described something that you can't picture, you can go to the blog post and check it out.
Most of the links are the ones we used while making the notes for the episode. So that was kind of our thought there, is we wanted to share
references,
the sources we had used.
And have I missed anything?
Not that I can think of.
I think that's it. We release episodes every fortnight.
The Patreon.
Yeah. Patreon. Yes, we are on Patreon. Please give us money. We love it.
Get some money, you guys. Come on.
See, this is why we're a small podcast.
Yep.
The thing we forget is the
and
part
that's it. Thank you for
that's it. Yeah. Thanks.
We're just happy.
Feel free to like and subscribe or not, whatever.
Yeah. Hey, I don't want to pressure you.
But yes, we are on Patreon. We have an ever-growing list of really dynamic, engaged listeners, which we absolutely love. We have rewards for people who sign on. We do all sorts of bonus audio.
Yeah, we do after
that only the Patreons get.
Little bonus after sessions where we discuss the episode, discuss other ideas parallel to it, and then usually what other movie thing has recently come up in.
Yeah, or like our Jurassic Park series. The main episode was about the science of the movie, and then we did an extra episod bit afterwards on just our thoughts, non-science, just us chatting about what we think about the movie, and that went on to Patreon. Yes, exactly. So the lighter discussion of Fallen Kingdom was in the main episode, and then we were extremely virulent.
Yes,
in that bonus Patreon episode.
There was quite a tone shift.
So yeah, patrons get all sorts of cool extra stuff. And we release episodes every other Sunday, so you can check those out. And that's when we're not doing fun stuff in between and giving ourselves more work. Yeah. And you can also find me on Twitter. You can try to find Will on Twitter. We're trying to get him to.
I'm technically on there. I put up a profile picture the other day.
Here's what I've done for friends in the past, David. If you make them a Twitter account and just start tweeting for them, they'll get on real quick.
I'll give you my login.
I will tweet for you.
No.
Absolutely.
But you have to tweet things that they are uncomfortable with, so that then they
want snakes all the time. It'll be all the best snake posts.
Right. So then they want to take over their Twitter account to stop you from. That's how I got our volcanologist Abe on Twitter. I created a Vulcan Abe Twitter account and just started talking about volcanoes in faux Spanish, and eventually he was like, "Nope, I need this to stop." And now it's his.
Will, you were saying you were going to give me your login?
I'll get back to you on that. I'll let you know.
Yeah, no, let me. I'll take it.
Keep an eye on your mailbox. I'll send it priority post.
And as I mentioned before, I did the Sloth Q&A, which we've been in discussion back and forth about, and eventually some of the audio from that, maybe not the whole thing, but the whole thing is available on your YouTube page. People can go watch that. Yes. And then some of the audio might make it into a podcast at some point in the future.
Yeah, you just have to find the time to organize that.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, I'm just letting people know that if that's a thing that they're interested in, then go check that out. Go listen to the Sloth episode first, and then when you get as mad as Robert did, you can go listen to the Q&A. And
yes, but you should definitely go check our YouTube. We are on YouTube. We don't have videos mostly. It's just the audio of our podcast. But the one real video project we did was our live stream with Ryan and Robert. So definitely check that out. Ryan and Robert are cool guys.
It was a lot of fun.
Well, thanks, man. And thank you both for joining me. This was a lot of fun just now, talking about your guys' research and the podcast and just doing science in public. It's really, I don't know. I get a lot out of these discussions. I hope you guys did too, and I just want to thank you both for joining me.
Now, Ryan, before we cut it off, I'm gonna flip it around real quick, if I may, and ask you a question.
Please.
We are about to release episode 40. What is it like to be coming up on 300?
Yeah.
Exhausting. Mostly. It's probably been about 200 episodes since I cared about our statistics. That eventually does wear out. You eventually get tired of just refreshing the stats page and seeing every new download. Honestly, though, it's just become such like a part of my identity and who I am as a person and a scientist. I still struggle with the self-promotional aspect of like identifying myself as a podcaster to people, and when I'm with folks who are happy to promote myself for me, they'll say like, oh yeah, Ryan does a podcast, Ryan, you should tell them about it. I still get very like shy, and I'm just like, oh well, you wouldn't care about it. But then when I actually tell people what the show is and talk about the impact we've had and talk about the content we've put out over the years, you know, people are genuinely impressed, and that is something I'm legitimately very proud of and proud to have produced and put out into the world. For, you know, for all the missteps and mistakes and just dumb stuff we say, I still think there's a lot of value in the work we've done. And the thing that I think is the best part of doing the podcast, and this will sound like a very politician-y answer, but it's true, is we still maybe once or twice a year get an email from somebody who says, I started listening to the show and now I'm going back to school in the fall. Because of the show.
That's so cool.
That's awesome.
And I cannot articulate how powerful a message that is to trick someone into making that bad a decision.
Right?
You have that much power in your voice. You're like Black Bolt.
I won't say his name for sake of his own privacy, but like, there was a guy who listened to the show who, when he started listening to the show, he was driving a cab, and then he went back to school and got a degree. And so it's like, that kind of stuff does happen. And maybe that kind of person is the kind of person that's going to get motivated, and they're going to find that thing that drives them to the point where they're willing to make that big of a change and make that big of an effort to change their life. But when they write in and say that it was us and that means something to them, that's what makes it worthwhile. Like, that's the good stuff.
That's so cool.
Absolutely. All right, we'll keep doing it then.
I've convinced you to keep doing a thing you like.
Yeah, we'll send you an email. We listened to your description and we decided to keep doing our podcast.
That's awesome.
My mind flashes, I see the ashes of the masters who touch the masses. I ask if I'll ever be one. When I die, will heaven be done? What will my legend become? I will forever be young through old tales. A breakdancer down at Odell's. Streets named after me is where my soul dwells. Desires of a church choir, Trinity united. I think of good memories that Hennessy provided. Memories divided by perception. Will it be water for chocolate or resurrection? The path to perfection is rarely achieved. I head in a direction I dream and believe. An underground dude that overachieved. From the windy city I was blowing they weaves. Somewhere along the way I aired out them seas. But to stand out some days you may freeze. Degrees.
Who lives and who dies? Who holds on to all our lives? Time and time and time again. Will they tell your story in the end? Who dies, who tells your story?
Yo, the anticipation.
All right, well, that was a really fun chat with Will and David. Hope you enjoyed it and consider checking out their show. Since the conversation went a little long, we're just going to do one quick PaleoPOW from me before heading out for the day. And let's see, I have an email from Susan, kind of an older email, but it actually responds to something we talked about in the episode just now, so I thought it was an appropriate one to read here. First of all, if you don't remember, a very long time ago, we had a conversation about why you never see people going to the bathroom, in particular number 2, in movies. And my argument at the time, and I guess still, is that it is not a thing you see because it is not typically relevant to forwarding the narrative. You know, maybe like a Dumb and Dumber exception there, but most of the time the day-to-day bodily functions aren't represented in stories because they're not pertinent to the story. Same way you rarely see characters actually eating food on film because also eating food on film doesn't look cool unless you're Brad Pitt. So the email from Susan, she thanks us for asking a previous question and says, but Ryan, you and I are going to fight. Forwarding the narrative, we don't see or hear humans defecating in stories because we know that they do. They are like us. They are species that we know nothing about, save what is written about them. You have no more proof that they do defecate than I have proof that they don't. So she disagrees with me quite vehemently on that front, and I'll leave it there. I don't think we need to discuss that any further. Secondly, in terms of teaching creationism in school, I'm with you guys. It's a bad idea. My husband is an elementary school teacher, and where we will lose this fight is in the curriculum. When the schools put standardized testing in place, my husband's job went from educating young minds to helping them pass the test. My husband does not teach evolution because it is not on the test. Every time he spends teaching something that isn't on the test, he runs the risk of lower test scores, which means less funding for the school and less privileges for the students. At his school, there is already no recess and a 45-minute lunch. And me, Ryan, I just want to remind you that we're talking about an elementary school here. My husband hates it, but he isn't given a choice. If creationism is put on the standardized test, I promise you teachers all over the country will start teaching it. And who creates the tests? We don't know. He's not even supposed to ask. If Tennessee can get creationism on the test as a quote-unquote weakness or whatever that is, it is what will be taught. Just my thoughts on it. Keep up the great work, Susan. So a couple things in there. I actually think that's a really interesting point because that speaks to the power of standardized testing and how teachers don't really get to design the curriculum around what they do or don't believe in the first place. And so we talked a little bit about what people believe in the interview with Will and David. But here, Susan kind of makes the point that that's not really super relevant when it's just about teaching to the test, which is frustrating for a lot of reasons. And I think this is another angle for why that is maybe not a great way to do public education. And I also didn't know the thing about not being allowed to ask who makes the tests. That's a really interesting point. I mean, I understand the need for secrecy. If you want to standardize the test, then you have to keep parts of it hidden. I guess the more opaque the system is, the harder it is for people to figure out how to game it. Not that Susan's husband would try to game it, but there are always bad actors in every system who will try to take advantage of things if they can. So that's really interesting. I would love to hear from other teachers about similar experiences with the standardized testing world. Have things changed in the past few years since this email was sent? What's kind of the situation there? So if you were a teacher or have recently experienced the wonderful world of standardized testing, maybe write in and contribute your thoughts on that topic. No patron thesis this week because I am solo, but if you would like to get your own BSSO, Bachelor of Science Sort of, you can go to patreon.com/science sort of and sign up for the Avogadro's Army level or higher. And with that, I think that's all we have for this week. So thanks for listening. Go check out the show notes for this episode at sciencesortof.com and be sure to come back next time for a whole lot more science.
Sort of.
Oh, I messed it up. We should do that again.
Nope, that's one take and we're out.
All right. Well,
visit sciencesortof.com for show notes, links to all the stories we talked about, and ways to interact with the hosts, guests, and other listeners. Science Sort of is brought to you by the Brachiolobe Media Network of podcasts, with audio engineering by Tim Dobbs of the Encyclopedia Brunch podcast. That's all for this week. See you next time on Science Sort of.
And I have to break slightly because Julie, my wife will want to try this beer. She'll be annoyed if I don't give her a taste before I kill it. Julie, where'd she go? She was just in the other room.
What's she doing back there? I never knew what she's doing.
Her loss. It's a Scandinavian Saison. Would you like to try it and tell the fine folks what you think?
It's pretty tasty.
I think so too.
Could be a little colder.
Oh, we took too long in the first segment. That's my fault.
I just see the laughter.
Oh, that's hilarious. Our talkativeness made your beer warm.
She can't hear you guys. She can only hear me. She just saw you guys laughing on the screen. So,
hello.
It's mine.
No, it's mine now.
No, you gave it to me.
I want it though. Well, I need it for the show. All right, well, bring me a different beer.
We should have talked longer, then she wouldn't want it.
Bye. All right, so that was Julie's Scandinavian Beer Corner.